Hey, welcome back to Wages and Employment at Wilfrid Laurier University. In past videos, we characterized people's preferences and constraints. Today, we are bringing that together to characterize how individuals make their choices. For reference, you should pair this video with readings in Chapter 2 of your textbook. Now, I want to start again by reminding everyone of the story that we're building here. In previous videos, we framed how people gain utility, their happiness, from the consumption of goods and services, and their leisure time. And then we looked at what limits their happiness, building their potential income constraint. In this section, we're bringing that together to structure how people ultimately choose how much to work. We can take that story and translate it into some simple equations. This is still simply telling us that people want to be as happy as possible. They want to maximize their utility, realizing there are limits to what they can do, characterized in their potential income constraint. And they will choose consumption and leisure time with all of that in mind. When we return to mapping this into a two-dimensional space in the next slide, we're going to look for the highest indifference curve possible on the outer edge of our potential income constraint. So we start here with leisure on our horizontal axis, consumption on the vertical axis, and our potential income constraint in blue. I've written it here in terms of C and L so that it is more obviously at the equation of a line with the intercept at the full income level and a slope equal to the wage rate. Now, bring in a mapping of indifference curves, and we want to look for a point that is feasible, but on the highest indifference curve possible. That's going to represent maximizing utility. That happens at this point here, marked A. This is the solution to our constrained utility maximization problem. And in this case, we call it an interior solution. The equilibrium is characterized as a tangency between the potential income constraint and the indifference curve. And the person has chosen a consumption leisure bundle with some positive number of work hours. We're going to characterize that solution with a single equation. This is the point where the marginal rate of substitution between consumption and leisure is equal to the wage rate. Now, we can easily see that the wage rate is the slope of the potential income constraint. In our section on preferences, we discussed how the marginal rate of substitution represents this willingness to exchange leisure for consumption. And we constructed a formula tying the slope of the indifference curve to a utility function, so that this is really our key condition for an optimal choice when we are characterizing an interior solution. So here we're looking at that marginal rate of substitution between consumption and leisure being equal to the wage rate. But we also need to make sure that the point where this slope is equal to the wage rate falls on our potential income constraint. So we have this second condition, which is simply our potential income constraint, where the value of our consumption is exactly equal to our total income. So we're not wasting anything here. Now, we know that many people don't participate in the labor market, and some of them are able to work if they wanted to, such as many retirees. So why don't they choose to work? Here, we're looking for a corner solution. First, we're going to be looking at a person with a fairly high valuation of leisure. So they have steep indifference curves and a higher marginal rate of substitution between consumption and leisure. To get them to give up some leisure, they need to gain a lot of consumption goods. When we find the feasible point that makes them as well off as possible, it ends up being at this kink in the budget constraint, at point B here, where their choice of leisure is equal to their full-time endowment so that they don't work at all. And their consumption is entirely based on their non-labor income. One of the ways to characterize a non-participant in the labor market is to say that the wage being offered in the labor market simply wasn't higher than their reservation wage. The reservation wage is defined as the wage at which a person is indifferent between working and not, as though you will reserve your time for the beach until the wage is at least this high, and then you'd be okay taking on at least a little bit of work. In our diagram, this is measured as the slope of the indifference curve at that point B, where you have that option of just being in the market for a second or not at all. And the slope is drawn here as the dashed orange line with a slope equal to WR. Now for this individual, we see that the wage rate being offered in the market, as W is equal to the slope of their potential income constraint, is less than the reservation wage. So they have chosen not to work. Now keep in mind the reservation wage is defined exactly the same way for a participant. We still look for that point where the person is entirely indifferent between working for even a second or not at all. Here, that's marked in at point D, with the slope of the indifference curve at that point representing this person's reservation wage. Notice this individual places a much higher value on their consumption of goods and services than in our last example. So the indifference curve is much flatter at that point, and the reservation wage is much lower. We can also clearly see the slope of the potential income constraint is steeper than the line for the reservation wage. Because the market is offering a wage higher than their reservation wage, this person chooses to work a positive number of hours here at point A. So now that we have a basic framework set up, our next video is going to look at how things move around and how decisions change when our potential income constraint changes. We'll see you then.